Good evening, everyone. On the behalf of the JNU Academy, I, Jyoti, would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for joining the today's session on Indian democracy, a theoretical and comparative assessment. Before we formally begin the event, a word of introduction about JNU Academy. JNU Academy is an entirely student-driven open forum. The foundation principle of the forum is to enrich the possibility of a democratic and the civil discourse inside the campus on the issue of the social value. Since its inception in 2017, the forum has conducted talks, reading sessions, and the book discussions that touch on the various themes and materials. The forum has been blessed to have generous and engaging audience since the time when we began the initiative. I would request the esteemed audience to please consider contributing monetarily. Your donation helps us to keep running the initiative and pay for our posters and the key. With this, let me now introduce our esteemed panelists for the today's event. The main speaker for the today's lecture is a Professor Ashutosh Varshney. He is currently the sole government professor of the International Studies and the Social Science and a professor of Political Science at the Brown University, where he also directs the Saxena Center for the Contemporary South Asia at the Varshney Institute for the International and the Public Affairs. He has written many books, include The Battle Half Won, Collective Violence in Indonesia, Ethnic Conflict and the Civic Life, India in the Era of Economic Reforms, Democracy, Development and the Countryside. His research and the teaching covers the three areas: ethnicity and nationalism, the political economy of development, South Asia politics and political economy. The discussant for the today's talk is Ajay Gudawardi. He is an associate professor at the Center for the Political Studies, JNU. His publications include The Politics of Post-Civil Society, Maoism, Democracy and Globalization, and India After Modi, Populism and the Right, and the more recent book, The Politics, Ethics and Emotion in New India. The chair for the today's event, Dwaipayan Bhattacharyya, is a professor at the Center for the Political Studies, JNU. His area of interest lies in the democratic theory, political process, and politics in India, and especially a left-wing mobilization in West Bengal. His publications include a monograph titled Government as Practice, an edited book interrogating social capital. Before I invite our esteemed panelists, I will just outline the format of today's discussion. Professor Varshney would come first and speak for 40 to 50 minutes. Our main discussant, Dr. Ajay Gudawardi, will then come and speak for 15 to 80 minutes. After this, Professor Bhattacharya will give his concluding remarks. Professor Varshney would then come in and respond to the points raised by our discussant and the chair. In the second round, we open it for the audience and take it further. Now I hand it over to the Professor Bhattacharya to continue the proceedings.
Thank you very much, JNU Academy, for this opportunity to be here. And it's a real privilege and treat to invite Professor Ashutosh Varshney to this university and its other students. He was here in JNU as a student, and he's very excited to be among you again. And he has given the basic introduction for Professor Varshney. He has three major monographs, all of you know that, several edited volumes, and a large number of research articles in some of the world's most prestigious journals. He is among the most influential writers of his generation on Indian politics and democracy. There's no doubt. One cannot but be struck by his ingenious capacity to offer impeccable arguments based on solid empirical facts to make complex theoretical analysis in the most accessible language. And this is something that every researcher aspires to, but very few people actually can achieve that level of clarity and erudition. I read his first major work, Democracy, Development and Countryside, while I was working on land reforms in Bengal. Big farmers movement rocked Indian establishment in the early 1990s. Varshney showed how democracy gave countryside a voice, and also how intra-agrarian conflicts have prevented such voice from playing a more decisive role. The work brought sociology into political economy, offered a nuanced reading of class interests, together with social selves, identities, caste identities, and so on, and added a new dimension to my understanding of rural-urban relations, which until then was under the hegemonic influence of towns of trade or dominant proprietary classes or capitalist subjugation via painful transition. His second monograph, Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India, is an excellent example of how social science can touch the affective dimensions of the victims of violence. Until the time the work was published, the scholarly field was flooded with studies that linked civil society with democracy and civic community with social capital. But drawing a connection between civil society and ethnic conflict was conspicuously missing. Filling up this gap, the book asked why intercommunal riots erupt in some but not other cities, despite them having comparable demography or history. With his magisterial command over a huge data set, Varshney showed how riots or its absence depended a great deal on the character and depth of inter and intra-communal relations, both in formal civic and informal neighborhood spaces. The last book I read, Battles Half Won, India's Improbable Democracy, published a year before Narendra Modi stormed to power in Delhi, combined lucidity with scholarship in a manner that is almost impossible to emulate. Addressing a host of intriguing paradoxes of India's democracy, emerging from its societal and economic inequalities, insufficient evolution of power to the states, lack of class pressure of the poor for ending poverty, etc. The book makes a clear case that democracy in India is not a lie, maybe a disappointment. And given the present state of authoritarianism, it is acutely so. But it is undeniably pregnant with possibility and hope. We now turn to the speaker, Professor Varshney, for the continuation of his dialogue with JNU community. Following his talk, as she has mentioned, Professor Ajay Budavarti will be the discussant. Ajay is a dear colleague and a prolific writer who has written extensively on India's democratic journey with both theoretical flourish and empirical insights. I am a timekeeper for the event from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhattacharyya, for those touching points. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Let's see. It's a let me first say, as a preface, it's a great pleasure to be here at JNU. JNU is associated with a very important transformation in my life. I was 19 and a half years old when I came to JNU, and the plan was to take the IS exam at 21. In that year and a half, my life was transformed from a potential IS officer to an academic and a researcher. I helplessly fell in love with research in that year and a half and never looked back. So JNU is the reason I am a professor and not an IS officer. therefore it's always a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed 4 beautiful years of my early intellectual life, learned very greatly before going away to the United States. Now, I noticed that I've been told that the audience is interdisciplinary, so I will cut out some very technical political science in my prepared slides, from my prepared slides, and present the argument in a more interdisciplinary way, as you'll see. So the theoretical and comparative assessment will have quite a bit of theory, but a theory that goes beyond political science. The anchorage here is, one second. The anchorage here is in democratic theory. Some may say that the term democratic theory is somewhat imprecise. It should be democratic theories. But I'd like to defend the case that there is a mainstream democratic theory and it's worth paying a lot of analytic attention. And on that basis, it is clear that the worldwide recognition of India's democracy as historically exceptional, especially given its level of income, is an unmistakable proposition. But this claim, and that's my more recent work, my work after Battles Half Won, the last 10 years are being summarized in a new edition of Battles Half Won that Oxford University Press will publish next year, and I have to do 50 pages on Modi and democracy. That's last 10 years. That book came out just as Modi was coming forward. So the claim now, the way my argument is developed, basically say that this claim that India's democracy is exceptional, according to democratic theory, is a claim about India's electoral democracy, which must be distinguished from the idea of India as a liberal democracy, and historically, India has functioned less well as a liberal democracy, and even worse in the last 10 years. So, over the last decade, India's democratic evolution reached a stage where the electoral and the liberal aspects of democracy developed a huge conflict. India's electoral democracy, my claim has been for the last 10 years, on the whole remained quite vibrant, but the liberalism of its polity went into serious decline. So this we came to call, the political science theory, political science mainstream, came to call democratic backsliding. It was not a term that was used in 2013, and certainly not in a noticeable way when Battles Half Won came out. And it's rooted, the democratic backsliding is rooted in an ideology which has guided Delhi, or India's ruling regime in Delhi for the last 10 years or so. The party received widespread electoral support in 2014 and 2019, but its ideology is fundamentally illiberal, I'll show in what particular way, using political theory, and at its core, fundamentally unconstitutional. We can also think about the conditions under which Hindu nationalism can become constitutional. This is an intriguing thought, an intriguing idea. And Ajay and I and the Vice Chancellor of National Law School, we were at Cambridge University in a conference about 5 weeks back, and there Sudhir Krishnaswamy, who's a first-rate legal and philosophical mind, made the case that Hindu nationalism could become constitutional. So it's worth thinking about under what conditions that would be true. But as of now, it's fundamentally unconstitutional. And that is why the clash between the electoral and the liberal deepened, because it's not committed to either constitutionalism of the standard Indian variety or to liberalism. And what was electorally victorious began to clash with what was constitutional. This was the argument until 4th June 2024, when the results surprised most people except Yogendra Yadav, and I was closer to his estimate, though I was not at 240, which he was. But the question, the analytical question, June 4, 2024 raises is very simple. Would the 2024 reverses for the BJP halt democratic backsliding? My answer is most probably yes. Almost certainly I would say yes, but in what form, I will give you my take on that. So here is a summary, just a few snippets of what political scientists have said about Indian democracy. Something is going on here. Why I can't move? Yeah. So it's not moving. Should I use this? It's not moving there, and I can see what's here. No, it's, I think it's just sorry about this. It would be much better if you see my slides also. I think this should work. So what should I slide show? Yes, okay, go back and check. So here is the first recognition of, by a great social scientist, political scientist / sociologist, Barrington Moore, writing in his classic Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. This is what he wrote. As a political species, in 1966, as a political species, India does belong to the modern world. At the time of Nehru's death in 1964, political democracy had existed for 17 years. If imperfect, the democracy was no mere sham. Political democracy may seem strange, both in an Asian setting and one without an industrial revolution. And that is a very important point. After the industrial revolution, democracies have emerged only after the industrial revolution, it's like universal franchise democracy. Have emerged only after the industrial revolution, but India had a universal franchise much before. The manufacturing over GDP in 1947 was probably 4% or so, or 5%. And later on, he goes on to add that India's literacy rate in 1947 was 17%. Under those conditions, no democracy, no universal franchise democracy has ever survived. And please note that the first great modern liberal theorist, John Stuart Mill, was actually not in favor of universal franchise, wanted the poor not to have the right to vote. Only the property should have, and the literate people have the right to vote. There's some interesting things to say, representative government, but what gets you must satisfy. But in any case, universal franchise democracy before industrial revolution was a novelty. And that was first noted by Barrington Moore in that classic. Then, perhaps the greatest democratic theorist we've had since 1945, in my view, indisputably so, but it's always good to say arguably the greatest. It's always a more precise statement. Robert Dahl, 5 years after, noted that India was a deviant case of a polyarchy, which was his term, for democracy. The difference between the two need not detain us here. Polyarchy for him was democracy. And then his magnum opus is a book called Democracy and Its Critics. You can hear me in the back, right? You can hear me in the back there. In his magnum opus, he wrote that India is undoubtedly a leading contemporary exception to the democratic theory. Then you have the next big work, which was very statistical in orientation, Adam Pravorsky and his colleagues. The odds against democracy in India were extremely high. And as I often noted, that in one of the seminars, at one of the conferences that I was with him, he said if there was something called negative odds, there's nothing called negative odds, statistically speaking. The lowest would be 0. He said if there's something called negative odds, that's what Indian democratic potential looked like. It was that close to 0. But nonetheless, democracy survived. And then those who do political theory, per se, here is John Donne, who has attracted a notice of a lot of political theories. The most surprising democracy there has ever been, surprising in its scale, in its persistence, among a huge and for most of its existence still poor population, and in its tensile strength in the face of fierce centrifugal pressure. John Donne in 2014. So this sort of, one can present quite a bit more, but this gives you a good overview of how the discipline of political science, including its normative political theory, has looked at India's democratic performance since 1950. Okay, so now let me summarize the key elements of modern democratic theory. There's normative side and there's empirical side. The normative side has a minimum requirement, namely elections. No elections, no democracy. It's a necessary condition. And then the electoral part of democracy is further split by Dahl, and all of us have accepted that over the last few years, over the last 4 decades actually, more than 4. Contestation and participation. And what does it mean by these two concepts? On one axis, contestation. Can the opposition freely contest the incumbent, the rulers? That's contestation. 2, participation. Is franchise restricted? Can the voters freely vote? They may have the legal right to vote, but they may not be able to freely vote, which was true in much of American post-Civil War history, at least in the South. And secondly, a broader requirement where political theory becomes very important, which says that democracy cannot be confined to elections alone. That's episodic, that's every 5 years. What happens in the 4 years or 5 years between elections is also important. And in what way is it important? You have to think about 3 liberal freedoms or civil liberties. Freedom of expression. Can you freely express yourself at JNU or in the newspapers? So newspapers can freely express themselves. Can citizens do that in general? Is there freedom of religious practice? Is there freedom of association, which is essentially civil society argument? Can you form non-governmental associations, and can those non-governmental associations freely function? So freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, and association, plus minority protections. This is a special point. This was never part of liberal political theory until 1945. So what is it that 1945 or the period between the 2 wars did to liberalism or liberal political theory is a very important point. This is not there, certainly under John Stuart Mill and others. Empirically, the empirical relationships that people have figured out about what is it that happens in democracy, whatever is normatively required, but once those normative practices are normative requirements are practiced, what exactly happens? Where does it work well? Where does it not work well? So one relationship is income and democracy. Democracies can be established at any levels of income, but they survive generally at high levels of income. The mortality rate of democracy at low levels of income is extremely high. And I'll give you some data a little later on this. And then the second question, second empirical relationship, which is very robust, is that the richer and the more educated the voter, the higher the odds he or she would vote. The lower the education, the lower the odds that the citizen would vote. It's a robust finding, repeatedly true. How India violates it, we'll see more. So let's look at my claim that electoral vibrancy is one way to describe India's performance, India's democratic performance for decades now. Since 1952, 18 national elections, 390 state elections. Power has changed hands 8 times in Delhi and tens of times at the state level. We don't count it anymore as political scientists, how many times at the state level we get turnovers. There is a very interesting idea, which is not on the slide, but perhaps it's worth noting. Samuel Huntington came up in his democracy, the second democracy book, with a very interesting idea. He called it, you can see how intuitively plausible it is. It's the claim that you cannot imagine democracy to even have started a consolidation process, right? You cannot imagine that human democracy to have started an institutionalizing process, a consolidation process, unless a two-turnover principle has been satisfied. What is this two-turnover principle in his second book? The idea is that if incumbents today lose elections, then they step out, and those who win, then become incumbents. And when those who win today, when they lose, they must step out without questioning the elections themselves. Once both this has happened twice, you can say that people have understood that the electoral verdict is to be accepted as a fundamental norm, and those who lose just step out without questioning the verdict, without saying that elections were rigged, etc., etc. Right? Of course, if they're rigged, then you have to show they're rigged. But one's electoral outcome must be accepted by the incumbent. And if this happened twice, then democratic consolidation has begun. So in India's case, power has changed 8 times. So the Huntingtonian principle has been satisfied 4 times over. In 1952, 81 million votes were cast. In 2024, 642 million votes were cast, including 312 million by women, slightly lower than men this time. That was not true in 2019, only slightly lower. Statistically not very significant. Turnouts are now routinely in excess of 60%, including 66.3% in this past election. That is only slightly lower than 2019. But what is important to note is that Mr. Modi won 2 most participatory elections in Indian history. 2014 and 2019, turnouts exceeded 65% for the first time. No other victories could have been bigger, they were, but not with 65% of the voters voting. That has to be noted. And the other part of electoral vibrancy is that we pay too much attention to what happens in Delhi. Half of state governments are still ruled by parties that do not rule in Delhi. And that has been more or less consistently true. There was a period between 214 and 217, and then 219 and 221. It was not true, but basically it was considerably below 50%. But it just springs back to 50%. Springs back to 50% of state governments run by a party that doesn't run Delhi. And then here is, on who votes, the most striking reputation that India has produced. We'll come in a moment. Until 1989, following mainstream democratic theory, the richer and more educated citizens used to vote more than the poorer and the less educated. Since 1989, defined democratic theory, the poor and the less educated have voted as much as, if not more than, their more fortunate co-citizens. That is the reason we say Indian democracy has taken a political turn. It has been only partially reversed since 2014. And India's urban middle class have begun to go back to the election booth, but not in such large numbers that pre-89 data, pre-89 trend would be reaffirmed. No. Okay, so here is the comparison. The title is comparative assessment. One is theory, one is comparative. So here is if I can show you, I can't think what the name, so let me point to it with my finger. This is the electoral democracy index that I've calculated based on, can you hear me if I step out the microphone to the back? So if you, there is the most important data-based democracy assessment institution of the world today, rightly or wrongly, you may agree or disagree, is VDEM, Variety of Democracy Institute in the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, now supported by EU, supported by all kinds of very important institutions. because the data they produce is used by all of us, and their overall the data is in many ways unimpeachable, though what they do with it you may critique. Like you can use the same data. So using the same data, here is the line I have constructed for the Electoral Democracy Index. The yellow line at the top is for North America and Europe, Western Europe. India's line is just below that, the orange line is just below that, and you'll see that at a fraction of European and American income. India's overall electoral democratic performance second only to North America and Europe, with a dip at the end, which we'll count. But historically, it's second only to North America and Western Europe, whereas India's income is a fraction of the income of Western Europe and North America, and that will play a role in the overall argument. Other lines shouldn't matter to you. They just don't matter. What is important is the first two lines here. Liberal Democracy Index, that will take us too far. We'll talk about it later. It's too much technical political science. We can come to it if Ajay wants to deal with the measurement of liberal democracy. Now, here is the income argument. The most systematic income argument that political science has produced is by Ashutosh. The data set covered 141 countries between 1950 and 1990. Income turns out to be the best predictor of democracy. It correctly predicted the type of regime in 77.5% of the cases. That means income was not the only predictor. In 22.5% of the cases, you had religion, colonial legacy, ethnic diversity, international political environment, but nothing was as good as income as a predictor of democratic longevity. India is clearly in the latter 22.5% case. Indeed, democracies that emerged from decolonization after the Second World War survived only in India, Mauritius, Belize, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And some of you probably would go to Google Maps to figure out where Vanuatu is. So that's the list. You can, if you don't want to do the post-1945 decolonized set of countries, then you have to include Costa Rica also, which was decolonized in the early 19th century. Costa Rica is perhaps the most successful case of democratic longevity. Its democracy began in something like 1948, is lasted till now, but its per capita income is 4 times higher than India's. And of course, you might say that it's such a small country, why are you comparing Costa Rica with India? But size is a very complicated variable in democratic analysis, and will take us too far. Once again, it's a very technical issue, which we don't have to burden ourselves with here. But here, this is the list. India, Mauritius, Belize, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. And the most surprising case of India, Ashutosh. Odds against democracy in India are extremely high, but please also note the second point here. If India is the biggest exception on the low income end, Singapore is the greatest surprise on the high income end. Perhaps you know that Singapore's per capita income is not only higher than that of the British masters, erstwhile British masters, or Germany, or France, but today, last 5 years, higher than that of the United States. United States is between $70,000 to $72,000 per capita. Singapore has crossed $75,000 per capita. The oil-rich countries are undemocratic. There is no non-oil-rich country in the world that is undemocratic except Singapore. Just a very important footnote to keep in mind. India on the low-income side an exception, and Singapore on the high-income side an exception. Now, to the second part of the argument, that India has functioned less well as a liberal democracy. So first, now we need to define what a liberal democracy is. What does political theory tell us? It's not, political theory doesn't give us only one conception, but generally speaking, if you see Ellen Ryan and a lot of other writers, or John Donne, you find that there's basically a consensus or relative consensus around these 4 areas. There have to be standard liberal freedoms of rights, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, sometimes we say, freedom of association for NGOs and other non-governmental organizations, freedom of religious practice and minority rights. Now, in India's case, the third and fourth collapse because India's minorities are primarily defined religiously. In America, minorities are defined racially. So the third and fourth question are analytically separable there. They are not analytically separable in India, they can be seen as one because India's minorities are religiously defined. These freedoms are especially important for democracy between elections. Why? Once the minimum and necessary criteria of contestation and participation are satisfied, normatively minimum, right? A democracy can attain higher quality, meaning it can become deeper, if liberal freedoms between elections are available, if citizens are free to speak, free to associate, free to practice their faith. Thus, we cannot have a democracy without free elections, but democracy is not equal to elections. A democracy is deeper and more meaningful if non-electoral dimensions of freedom, not simply free vote, non-electoral dimensions of freedom are also available. Then comes the post-1945 transformation in the idea of a liberal democracy. All post-1945 democracies, not only based on the idea of power stemming from electoral majorities, but also on minority protections. It doesn't have to be 50% plus. Depends on how the system is done. Electoral majorities mean those who get the maximum number of seats, right? That's the idea, first past the post. Majorities can protect themselves by their numerical weight. Minorities don't have the numbers, hence minority rights constitutionally protected in modern democracies or legally protected if the constitution does not exist. Without minority protections, democracy can become a brute majoritarian force. And the best example, of course, is Nazi Germany. There's also something else I've been working on, Jim Crow American South, 1880 to 1965. It's not known beyond America, and it need not detain us here. Let's just discuss the Nazi Germany, its implications of what happened to democratic theory. Carl Schmitt, I don't know, I think, I read him here first at Yale when I was a student, but Carl Schmitt is very widely read. A leading German legal and political theorist who ended up joining the Nazis, and he drew a distinction between democracy and liberalism. Democracy was about the expression of majority wishes, he argued. Liberalism meant protection of individual freedom and minority rights. And then the punchline. Why did he join the Nazi Party? Jews in Germany, he argued, could be protected under liberalism, not under democracy. If majority of Germans wish the extermination of Jews, 6 million Jews, okay. If a majority of Germans wish the extermination of Jews, that would have to be called a majority wish, and therefore a democratic wish. Extermination of Jews is equal to a democratic expression of German majority, therefore, and democracy could not defend Jews. Only liberalism, which would focus on individual rights and minority rights, could. And he didn't like liberalism. He wrote about that. He didn't like liberalism. He liked democracy, and therefore the Jews were expanded. This distinction was given up, therefore, after the anti-Jewish horrors of Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. All post-1945 democracies tend to have rights for religious, racial, ethnic minorities built into their political fabric. You cannot accept the claim that what is called the highest form of polity that humanity has achieved, a democratic polity, can authorize the extermination of millions of people on grounds of majority. It has to be checked. It became part of the definition of democracy. If they don't do that, they might not be undemocratic, assuming they have free elections, but they are less democratic than they were. Okay? So this is how the idea of minority protections became a very important part of democracy, because the idea of extermination of Jews, extermination of minority is part of democracy didn't make sense. Now let's examine Hindutva's commentary. It is aligned, the argument is aligned with the electoral democracy, but not with it. Those who've done political theory here, and many of you are from CPS, and sociologists also, a lot of them study not just sociological theory, but political theory. There is great debate in political theory between communitarian and liberal ways of thinking about societies. And whatever your position on Hindutva, against or for, if you use political theory, Hindutva has a communitarian notion of the party. And here is how the argument, this is what I've been able to extract from what they say. The rights and equality of citizens are not the starting point of Hindu nationalism, as in liberalism. Its core instead is a discourse of national loyalty, on which rights are thought to depend. Loyalty is seen as community-based rather than as something anchored in the individual proclivities or actions of citizens. Some communities are naturally loyal to India, others are not. The loyal should have superior rights and privileges. The less than fully loyal or disloyal should have less than fully loyal should have inferior rights, and disloyal no rights. The Constitution makes the loyal and the disloyal equal, and therefore Ambedkar's Constitution was wrong-headed for them. Read their ideological texts one after the other, right up till the Indian Party. Such equality of the loyal and disloyal violates the historical and cultural truths and saps national strength. For the communities most committed to India's culture and progress are not given commensurate privileges. And then the attention is especially drawn to Muslim disloyalty. If loyalty is not primarily an individual trait, to be legally established on the basis of conduct here and now, am I loyal or not, you have to establish in a liberal polity on the basis of whether my actions amount to disloyalty or sedition. Right? That has to be individually established. But that's not how they argue. They argue about communities that are unquestionably faithful to India and communities that are not. Now, it's not a question, individuals. Answer given a century ago by V.D. Savarkar. It has never been revised. The most important recent or relatively recent ideological text by Deen Dayal Upadhyay. Read almost everything he's written, Intellectual Humanism or Bharat Ki Musalman Samasya. The argument is roughly the same about communities and loyalties and rights. A loyal Indian is one who is attached to the geography of India, who was born in India and whose religion has indigenous roots. Savarkar called anyone who met these three criteria a Hindu. For him, a Hindu and an Indian are the same thing. A Hindu means a person who regards this land from the Indus to the cities as his fatherland, Pitrabhumi, as well as his holy land, Punyabhumi. Muslims and Christians cannot meet the third criteria. Even Jews cannot, and Parsis cannot, but their numbers are so small they didn't become part of the ideological discourse. Christian numbers are also small, and their role historically not as significant. Muslims have numbers, and they also rule, thus they are critical to Hindutva's conception of community. India's colonization, it's further argued, did not begin with the British capture of Bengal in 1757, but started more than a millennium earlier, when Muhammad ibn al-Qasim led forces of Umayyad Caliphate to conquer Sindh in 711. Later came the raids of Mahmud of Ghazni and the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, 1206 to 1526, and then Mughals violently crushed another Muslim Sultanate called Delhi Sultanate. Their last great act was creation of Lodi Garden next to the IIC. This is before they were captured in 1526 by the Mughals. Muslim princes and clerics humiliated Hindus by forcing them to convert. Evidence never fully provided. And if you read Richard Eaton and others, the medieval historians, they are not able to support this, that this is how conversions took place. For them, Sufis are very important. For them, the idea that those at the lowest rungs of Hindu caste order escaped. And Islam is much more important than the idea of force, of sword as the basis of conversion. And by destroying Hindu temples, which of course most would accept, with some of those sites later used for mosques. In the final and most recent act of treachery, quote unquote, they broke up the motherland. Pakistan emerged from a united British Empire. Instead of punishing India's Muslims for their disloyalty, for the birth of Pakistan, for the acts of Muslim rulers of the past, the leaders of India's freedom movement and its constitutional framers protected. The constitution maker said those Muslims who remained in India deserve the same rights as other citizens, and those who went away to Pakistan are Pakistani citizens. So there is the whole idea in the 1950s of Hamare Musalman. Hamare Musalman would be the same as Hamare Hindu. Right? Those who went away to Pakistan are different. That's a different issue altogether. They will be governed by Pakistan's polity and its principles. Nehru has lots of things to say on this. India's Muslims will be governed by India's constitution, not by Pakistan's principles. And not by, certainly the Muslims of today, you cannot blame them for what Aurangzeb did and what Varshney did. That is, cannot be a liberal argument. Certainly cannot be a liberal argument. That is taking the idea of community that far. That they are responsible for what Aurangzeb did, they are responsible for what Varshney did, they are responsible for Ibn Qasim's capture of Sindh. Right? They are, post-47 citizens, Muslim citizens of India. Constitutions makers do a distinction between political rights and cultural and religious rights. This should be kept in mind. This is a very important point that Ambedkar makes and constitutional scholars make. Separate electorate for Muslims that lasted from 1919 and in some local governments they started earlier, but certainly 1919 through 1946 were dropped. Instead, you had general electorates, and the idea of reserved electorates were not for Muslims, but only for SCs and STs. Right? So separate electorates as an idea was dropped. The idea of Muslim reservation, which is, if you look at what historians are writing about Muslims in UP's police service and UP civil service, their numbers were much higher than their numbers in the population. And you could argue that there was some kind of effective affirmative action under the British that was dropped. India's constitution drops that idea. It comes in another way in South India. Muslims are brought into affirmative action starting in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is 69%. This debate is once again coming out. Tamil Nadu had 69% affirmative action, and this is how it worked. 30% BCs, backward communities, 20% MBCs, most backward communities. So OBCs had 30 plus 20, 50. And OBC Muslims and OBC Christians came this way. Not as Muslims, but as OBCs. And then there was 18% SCs and 1% ST. This is how Tamil Nadu started with 69%. And that, even TDP is committed to that. All of southern India basically is committed to that with a very, including Karnataka, where this is a much, much bigger debate. So, the point here is that political rights were taken away. Administrative quotas were taken away from Muslims, but they were given cultural and religious rights. Their religious and cultural rights would be protected so as to remove the fear that Hindu majority might overwhelm them. Special protection to minority educational and cultural institutions, as well as religiously governed personal law that dealt with matters of family, marriage, and inheritance. For Hindu nationalists, this is pushtikarana, appeasement. The constitution simply called it the way to make Muslims Hamare Musalman. To give them the feeling that they are Hamare Musalman. Pakistan ke Musalman nahi. Aurangzeb ke Musalman nahi. Hamare Musalman. This idea. Now, so this is their attack on the constitution. Mr. Modi might say he doesn't want to revise the constitution, but every ideological text says India's constitution is wrong. Every ideological text says. India's constitution was fundamentally unjust to Muslims and was fundamentally partial towards Muslims. It was fundamentally unjust to Hindus and fundamentally partial towards the Hindus. First, what am I saying? Fundamentally partial towards Muslims and fundamentally unjust to Hindus. Every ideological text says that. Then finally, if the rise of Islam and Hindu decline in India are two sides of the same coin, what would a restoration of Hindu freedom, Hindu/Indian freedom mean? Rebuild magnificent Hindu temples, buildings and statues, and also attack historic Muslim influences in India and its culture. Alter the names of buildings, cities and roads. India's arts and architecture, films and music, literature and thinking must be purged of allegedly corrupting Muslim influences. Hindu India cannot be itself under the symbols of an earlier Muslim-dominated India architect. And for historical reasons, all of these arguments apply more to the north than to the south. Now, I, as a teenager, as was true in much of Allahabad or UP in general, I was trained in Hindustani classical music. I had no idea how to separate Hindu and Muslim from Yaman. I have no idea how to separate Hindu Muslim from Tori. Let's start the morning rather. Come to Bhim Palasi in the afternoon, how to separate Hindu and Muslim. Come to evening Yaman, how to separate Hindu and Muslim. Come to Darbari at night, how to separate Hindu and Muslim. I have no idea how to do it. And I have talked to enough musical experts given my interest in music. There's no way to do that. And a very important image recently emerged when Rashid Khan died. Rashid Khan is invited by one of the geniuses of Indian classical music, Bhimsen Joshi, to come and have Jugalbandi with him. So there is a 10-minute shortened version of Tori he sings, and a shortened version of Shankara he sings, and who introduces them to All India Radio? Ustad Vilayat Khan. And if you look at Rashid Khan died at 55, he was probably 27, 28 at that time. If you look at his eyes are looking at Bhimsen Joshi, and with such admiration and also with such gratitude that he picked me for the Jugalbandi. There was no way you would separate Rashid Khan from Bhimsen Joshi or Hindu and Muslim from Indian classical culture. So if you can't separate it, well, Mr. Modi, expel Yaman to Pakistan, expel Tori to Pakistan, expel Bhim Palasi from afternoon repertoire to Pakistan, and expel Darbari to Pakistan. There is a wonderful artist, Ali Sethi, who was our guest at it's important to say this because I think the point about art has to be brought out in a much more explicit way, right? So, Ali Sethi gave 3 lectures at Brown. He's not only a very good singer and very good artist, but also scholar. So he said for the first 20 years of Pakistan's independence, Pakistan's art musicians struggled with the idea how to separate themselves from India. So he said, how do we do Yaman without Krishna? How do we do Tori without Krishna? How do we do Bhim Palasi without whatever, Ram or Krishna? Right? How do we do these things? It's impossible, so they gave up the idea. That it's possible to separate the Muslim from the Hindu in the Hindustani classical tradition, and then they say, but there's 2 things they can retrieve from that tradition, which may be called more Pakistani than Hindu. One was Mehdi Hasan starting with ghazals, and the second was Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan owning up qawwalis. Qawwali and ghazal, they argued, could be presented as more Pakistani or more Muslim than Muslim Hindu. That claim also could be critiqued, but at least there was something. They couldn't do khayals. They couldn't do full-fledged 42-minute Yaman and call it a Pakistani rap. It's the same problem. Okay, I've taken you a little bit far in that direction, but I hope you can see the problem. Now, Hindutva's legal project, what has been achieved already? If there is a serious constitutional legal code to their politics, what has been achieved? End of Kashmir's special autonomy, India's only Muslim majority state according to them, and according to demography, yes, until 2019. Anyone who's read the history of Kashmir included in India also knows that Muslim majority was not the reason it got Article 370. And Article 70 was proposed by Patel. You read the constitution. That was the terms on which a princely state joined India to be affirmed later in a plebiscite which never took place. The reason had nothing to do with Muslim majority, but right since the early days of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the argument was that Kashmir got 370 because it's Muslim majority. This is yet another example India's constitution makers indulging its Muslims. तुष्टिकरण का पहला उदाहरण. Now the notion that Citizenship Act was amended in December of 2019. What does it say? It says, or anyone from Muslim majority neighbors can come, from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, Muslims can come. Please note, if had it been an argument of persecuted minorities from South Asia in general, they would have had to include persecuted minority of Sri Lanka, Buddhist majority state, where actually the people who claim they're persecuted are Hindu. And it would have to be Burma as well, Myanmar, where Rohingya are 5% of the population, they say they're persecuted, right? The attempt was to show that only Muslim majority nations persecuted. And Muslim majority nations will not have persecuted Muslim minorities. No, the Hazara of Afghanistan say they are persecuted. The Ahmadis of Pakistan say they are persecuted. And in many Shia circles of Pakistan, it's argued that Shias are also persecuted. It's in the Sunni majority nation. So only Muslim majority nations can persecute, and Muslims within Muslim majority cannot persecute. This is an assumption of the Amendment Act, right? Which you can see what it does discussively. There is no such distinction made in the original Citizenship Act. Neerja Dayal, a JU professor for very long, had the ultimate text on Indian citizenship. There are several chapters on this. There is absolutely no consideration of religion as the basis of citizenship distinction in that whole analysis. And finally, state level prevention of interfaith marriages. Last I counted, 7 states of India, maybe 6, 7, I think 7 states of India have anti-love jihad laws. And the one in UP is being made stricter as we speak. The claim is that, and the claim is incidentally, this is also very common elsewhere, it's not only an Indian problem. The claim is not that a Muslim woman cannot marry a Hindu man, right? Or a Muslim woman cannot have a sexual relationship with a Hindu man. It's the other way around. A Muslim man cannot have desire for a Hindu woman. Which is also true in the American South, where a white man can have desire for a black woman. A black man cannot have desire. That would be legally punished. A black man cannot have desire for a white woman. It's roughly the same problem. Okay. Now, the last 5 minutes. 2024 elections and electoral democracy. Now, in light of this theoretical and comparative discussion, what can you say about what happened on June 4th and its implications? From the perspective of electoral democracy, the issue was not participation, as I repeatedly argued, but contestation. If not contestation earlier, it became contestation here. The turnout was 66.3, very high. But unlike 2014 or 2019, there were serious doubts in January to March about how free the election was going to be. Literally for the first time. This was not even an issue in March of 1977. If those who read the history, this is not an issue whether the election would be free and fair. Opposition chief ministers were jailed, 2 of them. An attempt was made to freeze the bank accounts of the largest opposition party. I'm not even sure whether it was unfrozen. There is no further reports that I have read, but certainly we know that an attempt was made to freeze the bank accounts. Also, corruption was weaponized. Those opposition leaders willing to join the BJP had their charges suspended or even dropped in a couple of cases. These, in principle, had the effect of curbing the one big axis of Dawes' democratic conception, contestation. Electoral competitiveness was going to be lower as a result of this, making the BJP victory more likely. But the attempt failed. The BJP not only lost its majority, but fell 63 short of 2019 seats, 303, and 130 short of the declared target of 370, which generated all kinds of controversy for right reasons. Why 370? Why not 330? The reason is very clear. 2/3 of Lok Sabha is 364.4. You're not going to say, let's win 364.4. 370 also rhymes with Article 370. 370, therefore, is from a political rhetoric viewpoint a more interesting point. Just as from a political rhetoric viewpoint, Rahul Gandhi saying, why in this halwa, where were the Dalits? From a purely rhetorical viewpoint, that's an interesting point, whether or not you agree with it substantively. So they were not going to say 364.4 or even 365, 370. And 370 then generated all kinds of concerns. I did a lot of work in April and Agra and Noor. A lot of concern were raised about why 370. Why 370? In mass politics, for the first time, constitution was discussed. Otherwise, it was discussed at JNU, at Delhi School, at India International Center, India Habitat Center, and English language newspapers. Right? But finally, in mass politics, people were talking about a constitution. Why 370? Anyway, it was able to form a government only in alliance. Electoral democracy triumphed, and one can clearly say that we dem was wrong. We dem was writing 3 years ago that India had become an electoral autocracy, and some of us had a running battle on that particular issue. And our claim at that point was that half of state governments are not run by BJP. You can't call it electoral autocracy on that level alone. Now, so that's the election side. Now, what about the liberal side? So three things we have to discuss, a minute each. What happened, what should we expect on freedom of speech and expression? That is the first civil liberty we discussed in the liberal democracy. Second, what should we expect on freedom for civil society, universities, press, etc. And third, what should we expect for minority rights? 3 things that we put under liberal democracy. Freedom of expression has never had a huge political base in India. All political parties have undermined it at some point or the other. India's first constitutional amendment put some legal constraints on free speech, which many governments have politically exploited to silence critics. And here is civil liberties law exactly. In India, civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, association, movement, religious practice have been conceptualized as fundamental rights. And they are justiciable, meaning their infringement can be challenged in court of law. But Article 19 specifies limits on freedom of speech: libel, slander, contempt of court, decency or morality, and security. And the first constitutional amendment passed within 6 months of the promulgation of the Constitution added more conditions. Liberties can be constrained, quote, in the interest of the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order. The most important issue, etc. Public order. And who decides if public order is threatened? Of course, the government side. It's threatened by the expression, by free expression of preferences, free speech, etc. Please note that America's first constitutional amendment takes away all restraints on free speech. It's exactly the opposite. And here, both Nehru and Ambedkar piloted the first constitution through Parliament. There's a very interesting book on this, something called 17 Days of Storm or 18 Days of by a man called Young Scott, who's dramatized this quite a lot, but there's a very interesting narrative there about what happened, how in this case Nehru led it more than Ambedkar, but Ambedkar piloted it on behalf of the government as long as. So basically, the regime of civil liberties built into Indian democracy has been Janus-faced. Both commitment to civil liberties and the limits on them are written into the Constitution. Some governments have interpreted the restrictions more liberally than others. Others have simply used them harshly. The extent of allowed freedom has depended heavily on the nature of the ruling party in government. Courts have intervened, but not always in defense of citizens. Elsewhere, courts are your primary defenders of civil liberties in modern politics. But courts in this case have not demonstrated a principled defense of civil liberties in India, partly using the first constitutional amendment in Article 9. Civil society autonomy and freedom. Though legally protected, civil society freedom and autonomy also don't have a broad political base in India. Exceptions aside, political parties watch NGOs and their reach with considerable ambivalence. Resurgence of civil society seriously crushed during 2014 and 2025. There are studies of how many organizations lost their license to NGOs, lost their license to operate. How many lost FCRA, which is a simpler matter, but generally the license to operate. Resurgence of civil society will depend heavily on judicial support. Historically, courts are stronger when executives are weaker. This is an empirical political science. This is not a political theory. The judiciary, if approached for help, may now feel freer to reverse attacks on non-governmental institutions. But we can't predict judicial conduct for sure. Everyone is watching, we don't know the answer whether it will follow this idea that it can be stronger when the executive is weaker. Minority rights, finally. Minority rights are more likely to be a beneficiary of these elections. The two biggest alliance partners, PDP and JDU, substantially depend on OBC Muslim voter base. This is straightforward, elementary political science. In the great southern tradition, PDP is even committed to reservation for Muslims, as I discussed, via the OBC-BC route, originally created in Tamil Nadu. The Guspatian logic taken to its extreme will only make JDU and PDP electorally weaker in their states. PDP has to worry about it maybe 5 years from now, so you can say it's less relevant. JDU has an election coming up next year. Historically, the Muslim vote of Bihar splits equally between RJD and JDU. Roughly 85 to 90% goes this way. 10% is split between Congress and Paswan's party. Right? At 1% or 1.5% you can see there sometimes. But basically, 85 to 90% vote is equally split between JDU and RJD. So JDU has to decide whether they love BJP more or they hate RJD more. As a practical matter in politics. Right? If they lose the 50% of Muslim vote, they will lose the election. And RJD will win. And so this logic is not going to disappear. One should therefore expect, because of this, the collisional situation, expect declining enthusiasm in Delhi for a uniform civil code, whatever your normative position on that, even if you support it, as an empirical matter. A declining enthusiasm for the uniform civil code. A return to the National Registry of Citizens can be ruled out now, NRC. CAA has a lot of teeth if NRC is also there. Otherwise, it's okay. It has a purely discursive move outside Assam so far. A purely discursive move which makes Muslims lesser class citizens, right? But if NRC is also there, and we can discuss it at length, and I've written about it a lot. If NRC is also there, then CAA acquires CST. And a ban on interfaith marriages, in certain states, that could have been on a national scale if BJP had received 370. It would have allowed it to make constitutional amendments, including in those areas which are primarily in the state's realm. They did it for agriculture, which is primarily in the state. They did it for education for a lot of them, which is up. It's only in 1977, 78 it became, and BJP was not responsible for that, Congress was, when it became a matter in both states, concurrent list. And in the concurrent list, this Delhi becomes more powerful than states, right? So they could have done that. Lynching or bulldozing may not substantially decline, but they are a state level phenomenon. And other than Jharkhand, lynching and bulldozing are basically BJP state phenomenon. Those states run by BJP. Jharkhand has a tradition of lynching. And Jharkhand has not been a BJP state. It's been back and forth between various other parties. So to conclude then, There was a scholarly consensus about India's democracy being historically exceptional. That consensus was seriously undermined during 2019 and 2024. But 24 elections disprove the apprehensions of India becoming an electoral democracy. Electoral vibrancy continues. However, while some improvements in liberal freedoms may well take place, the overall impact remains unclear. Courts will be quite central. The BJP may have to scale its majoritarian project down, but one should not expect full erasure of the party's impulses and instincts. It is committed to a communitarian project. There are three critical variables over the next few months. One, will the party suffer electorally in the coming state elections? That will have an impact on its functioning and on its pursuit of the ideological project. Will there be internal factional fights within the BJP and within the Hindu nationalist family? Will they weaken the hold of the top leadership? That's also become an open question. It was not a question until the 2024 elections, or until the campaign, until we discovered in the campaign that RSS actually was not supporting the BJP in mobilizing vote. And what will courts do? Typically, if not always, courts are stronger when executives are weaker. Will the Supreme Court of India illustrate this old political science dictum or not?